This is part three of the rise of fascism under Benito Mussolini in Italy. Now, the Treaty of Versailles was a huge disaster for Italy because to get Italy to join the war, Britain made a lot of territorial promises to Italy. So if the Allies won, they were promised quite a bit of land. But during the actual negotiations during the Treaty of Versailles, very few of those promises were given. And Italy actually got very few territorial gains. And this kind of makes sense from the Allied perspective because, when the war broke out, Austria-Hungary wasn't exactly the strongest force. They did very badly, especially against Serbia. But when Italy joined, it's almost like Italy was determined to prove that we're an even weaker army than Austria-Hungary. But that doesn't mean that Italian people didn't suffer. And over 500,000 Italians died during the war and 1 million injured. So they did sacrifice, but they weren't given their due recognition from their perspective, whereas from Britain and French perspective, they hardly contributed much during the war. And Prime Minister Orlando, he was treated with disrespect during the negotiations at the end of the war, came back to Italy and he was dismissed. There was rampant poverty, lots of returning soldiers, came to Italy very, very angry, very disillusioned, and the whole Italian government was seen as weak and it was very chaotic. There were mass protests that were taking place. Socialists managed to make a lot of inroads amongst Italians who were very frustrated. There were over 600 instances in 1919 to 1920 where factories were taken over by workers. But in this climate of uncertainty and fear, the wealthier industrialists needed someone who could protect their interests, especially from these striking, protesting workers who were inspired by socialism. And Mussolini emerged as the type of person. He appealed to many war veterans and he established this fascist organization and black shirts, which is kind of like his private army of thugs. And they would get funding from some of the wealthy industrialists who were concerned about the socialist threat. And when he was able to crush strikes and uprisings, they would give him more money. He wasn't that successful in politics just yet. His party didn't do as well as he had hoped for in the elections. But in 1922, he planned a march on Rome. And originally, the prime minister tried to appease Mussolini. But when Mussolini was determined with a position in government, Mussolini said it's not enough. He wants to be prime minister. King Victor Emmanuel III actually conceded to Mussolini's demands. Now, one of the reasons for this is King Victor Emmanuel III was afraid of a civil war. And he was afraid of the idea that he's going to lose popularity if a civil war breaks out. They might overthrow him as king and install his brother. So he was very afraid of this whole chaos that had happened in Italy in the aftermath of the First World War. So he actually made Benito Mussolini king. The March on Rome wasn't actually that successful. They say that the Italian army could have crushed it very quickly, but the kings took a fondness of Mussolini and was afraid of the potential of sending the army to crush Mussolini's black shirts when they embarked on this March of Rome, and Mussolini became prime minister of Italy. When he was prime minister, he came into increasing conflict with Matteotti, a socialist politician. And Matteotti kept on accusing Mussolini very, very valid criticisms. And from Mussolini's interest, it would be very useful if something bad were to happen to Matteotti. And Matteotti eventually disappeared, and eventually his body was found. He was murdered. And it's not that difficult to trace his murder to Mussolini. Whether Mussolini ordered directly or was indirectly involved, most people knew that Mussolini was behind it. And as a consequence, they started boycotting parliament. This was a very uncertain time. There would be, assassination attempts on Mussolini's life. But what Mussolini eventually did was he still had support of the king. And eventually, when people were boycotting parliament, he just basically declared Italy, one-party state, fascists. And he was able to do this. And by 1925, he became the Duce of Italy, the supreme leader of this new totalitarian state.